The first time I went aboard the Shikari was in Belfast. The destroyer was in dry dock, and I had the opportunity to view her exquisitely beautiful, graceful hull in its entirety. A real treat for the eye. Before going to the gangway, I walked around the ship, glancing at the men scurrying about, making sketches in large notebooks. I only regretted that this ship, perfect in every way, was not a little larger. Then it could rightly have been considered the perfect escort ship. In my opinion, there was too much equipment on its upper deck. As a matter of fact, it was. Shikari was built during the First World War to fight German torpedo boats in the limited area of the North Sea. It was never intended to operate in the harsh weather conditions of the North Atlantic, and the designer who created it certainly could not have foreseen that the upper deck of the destroyer would be loaded in the future with 110 depth bombs and the droppers for them. I noticed that the waterline was now 18 inches higher than it had been in the days of the ship's youth. There was an element of inevitability in the fact that the designer's original intent in practice almost always turned out to be forgotten. During the comparatively long life of the ship, the guns evolved, and hence the guns mounted on it were changed from time to time. Only the hull remained unchanged. This problem existed as far back as Henry VIII, who ungodly overloaded the deck of the Great Harry with guns. Pepys mentions similar difficulties, and Captain Cochrane complained bitterly during the Napoleonic Wars that his ship was different, because the Admiralty had replaced the usual guns with others. A change in armament inevitably leads to an increase in the weight of the upper deck, shifting the centre of gravity upward and reducing stability. I venture to say that there are hardly many commanders of small ships who have not experienced a few unpleasant minutes at sea for this reason. The design metacentric height of the Shikari was 11 inches. This meant that the centre of gravity had to be 11 inches below the centre of buoyancy. Before leaving the dock, we conducted a stability check and found that the changes and additions made reduce the destroyer's metacentric height to 4 inches, very low for a ship of this size. As I approached the side of the destroyer, I noticed that the duty officer on deck kept his eyes on me. One could imagine how that poor fellow felt, waiting for a new commanding officer. I went up the gangway. The young junior lieutenant who greeted me took me to show me around the ship. Just then a giant crane was lowering the new aft chimney into place. "You lost the chimney? Did it fall overboard?" "Yes, sir." "Do you often have chimneys fall overboard?" "Not very often, sir. Pipes don't usually fall overboard." We walked slowly along the upper deck. "Where's the motorboat?" "We don't have one, sir." "But why?" "There's no point in getting one, sir. We lose them all the time. Supplies got tired of replacing them. So now we've got 2 Velbots instead of a runabout. We don't lose both at once very often, and it's easier to hook up a dinghy. We're moving on." "What happened to the bridge, Junior Lieutenant?" "We hit a big ship and the captain's cabin was flattened. Fortunately, he wasn't there at the time." I nodded. "Otherwise, we would have had to look for a can opener to get him out. I must confess that I never got a good night's sleep in bad weather in this cabin." Apparently, my joy and pride promised to be a difficult child, and so it turned out to be. A few persistent questions uncovered a glaring fact: the ship had not undergone commissioning after reserve or repair since 1938. At least 60% of the crew were old-timers, and many of the petty officers had started on the same ship as senior sailors. I could not understand why this crew of salted sea-wolves remained year after year on this old, not very seaworthy and extremely overloaded vessel. In the end, I came to a disappointing conclusion: people prefer this ship because it spends a lot of time offshore, repairing the damage received in bad weather. This conclusion could not please the captain. I was the senior officer of the group, which meant that I should be able to go to sea at any time as soon as the order came. And here the relationship of officers and crew is a significant factor. Shortcomings of a marginal nature may be underestimated or overestimated, but they should by no means be discounted. In wartime, the officers of the Western approaches were well in command of the situation. Personally, I always remembered that an escort that is only half effective is still better than no escort at all. In the evening, the XO arrived at the ship back from vacation. I was to have my first experience of commanding a career officer. I must say at once that I was disappointed by his frank and cynical statement that the assignment to the Shikari was a great good fortune, because there is never a problem with vacations here. The very next day I picked up a car at the Belfast military base and set off for Londonderry to see the new Commodore. If I was to change the outlook of the crew of the destroyer Shikari, in the person of the senior assistant must have a like-minded person, otherwise it will not work. Asking for a replacement for the chief mate on the first visit to the Commodore is not easy. In fact, it is always difficult, even on the 100th visit. No matter how fair and reasonable the request, there's always the possibility of falling into the ranks of people you can't get along with. I had never met Commodore G.W.G. Jim Simpson before, and did not know what kind of reception I was in for. I was fortunate. I met with attention and complete understanding. 3 days later, a new chief mate, Lieutenant J. Blackwood, appeared on the Shikari. As soon as his tall, gaunt figure appeared in the doorway of my cabin, I immediately felt that this was the man I needed. He was a real workaholic, a first-class specialist, and he came from a family of hereditary Koryaks who for many generations had been honouring the traditions of the Navy. Among Nelson's band of brothers was Captain Blackwood, and if he was anything like our Blackie, everything was all right on the famous Admiral's ship. As long as I was in command of the Shikari, the destroyer went to sea right on time. One time, however, it almost let us down. The generator failed. It was rotating properly, but did not produce current. Engineers from the base were urgently summoned, and a brainstorming started. Wise specialists tried to do what they could with the stubborn machine. Unable to bear the uncertainty, I also went down to the engine room to find out how long it would last. When I received a very vague answer, I recalled a piece of advice I had once heard from an old stoker about how to deal with machines that did not want to work. Go over them with a hammer, lad, and that's it. I took a sledgehammer lying nearby and struck 3 sharp blows on the striking machine. The method, though not new, proved to be reliable. The generator instantly came to life, and we went to sea on time. We left Belfast for Londonderry at the end of February. With 20,000 horsepower in 2 cars, it is a pleasure to run a ship, especially when compared to the 1,200 horses of the Verbena. On Belfast Lock we were sailing at 10 knots, the engines making 100 revolutions per minute. Going out to sea, I ordered the revolutions to be increased to 230 and was pleasantly surprised to feel the ship leap forward. The powerful engines were literally pulling the deck from under my feet. A strong wind was blowing from the northwest, but the sea under the shelter of the shore remained calm. Even as we approached Rathlin Island, the wind and current had the same direction, and there was no strong swell. As we rounded the island, we received the commander's orders by radio: take on fuel at Moville and proceed to an area 200 miles southwest of Iceland, where a landing craft with men has been sighted from the air. This was about 500 miles off the northwestern tip of Scotland. Moville was anchored on the seaward side of the River Foyle, which flows past Londonderry. The tide was already running out. As we approached the tanker, a strong westerly wind turned the stern of the Shikari toward a shallow sandbank on the east side. There was no room to perform manoeuvres, so I docked on the other side, which could hardly be called a good decision. There was simply no choice. To top it all off, the captain of the tanker turned out to be the former commander of the Shikari. On the approach to the tanker, I saw that the new captain of the Duncan standing at the rail and watching the approach of the destroyer. Mooring to the side of a vessel in a strong current is much more difficult than it may seem. As long as the current is uniform and runs parallel to the breakwater or wharf, it is comparatively easy, as there is a sufficient margin of speed at which the ship obeys the rudder, even if her speed relative to the ground is low. Shikari, having 2 propellers and a great deal of horsepower, was much easier to steer than the single-screw Verbena. Having obtained fuel, we put to sea. It was rapidly getting dark, and a gusty westerly wind was blowing, causing a no-nonsense swell. I very quickly had the opportunity to see what I suspected when I first saw the destroyer in dry dock. He desperately wet, flooded with waves, and his movement at a course of 45 degrees to the wave is even difficult to describe in words. I would call it the dancing of devils in hell. The explanation was simple: the destroyer was not big enough for the cargo it was forced to carry. Nose to the wave, the ship was generally normal, with a side wave also moved quite decently, although swayed like a log. It was obvious that shikari should be understood, felt, somehow to adjust to it. It was the only way to minimize the damage caused by the weather. To get to the right area, it was necessary to continue to follow a course to the northwest, which was clearly not to the destroyer's liking. I then decided that if I followed the Minch, where I could take advantage of speed, and then went out into the Atlantic, I would make a long detour, but would reach my destination more quickly. Our course starting from Bath of Lioi would go straight out to sea. So we set off through the Minch and were doing 25 knots in calm water all the way to the Hebrides. The feeling of power was amazing. The ship vibrated like a living thing. I immediately forgave it all its shortcomings and was seized by the incomparable pleasure of this unity of man and machine. How not to recall the famous advice of the great horse lover John Jorrocks: become a little blind to their faults and a little more forgiving of their shortcomings. I reported my actions to the commander. The reply message contained the question, "Are you sure that such a journey is really necessary?" My answer was brief and definite: for the preservation of the chimneys, yes. Before dawn we rounded Bath of Lewis and reduced our speed to 15 knots. All day we ploughed over dark green waves, rolling in from the west under low, heavy lead grey clouds. After the bright sunshine and sparkling warm waves of the Indian Ocean, I finally felt at home. This was the western approaches to the islands. It was here that the great battle against the German submarine fleet unfolded and was ultimately won. It was not a large-scale fleet action, like the Battle of Jutland or the Battle of Trafalgar. It did not have spectacular results like the aftermath of the Battle of Midway Atoll. It was a protracted, grueling, hard-fought battle with one of the strongest and most treacherous opponents in history, fought under a relentless rain of icy salt spray. In my opinion, our people still do not know what exactly happened on these harsh oceans. Water was rolling over the living decks of the ships. People went on watch in wet clothes, only to return 4 hours later soaked to the skin. They often found their dinner on the floor and had to wade through the water to get to the mess hall. The officers were in a similar situation. In our Navy, officers were traditionally stationed aft. To get to the bridge for watch, they had to overcome the entire length of the main deck of the destroyer, in some places very slippery, where the waves also raged and the depth was not small, 2 to 3 feet. Of course, there were always storm lines strung along the deck. If you clung to them tight enough, you probably wouldn't get swept overboard. But it was hardly pleasant to go on watch when even your underwear was soaked. But even in such conditions, the ships were always in full readiness to attack a submarine or conduct a rescue operation. I was the only person on our ship who had a real chance of staying dry. I had a sea cabin, a small cubbyhole, but just big enough for a bunk. From there I could go straight to the bridge. I was only wet if I didn't get my head out of the water fast enough when the ship's nose was in the water and the bridge was splashed with cold spray. At sea I usually never left the bridge, and the unfortunate barmaid had to carry my food across the upper deck, for which purpose a special hanger was made from a kitchen towel. Often being quite hungry, I watched anxiously for the approach of the messenger with the burning food. Well, where is he? Is he already coming? Will he come? I wish. What a high tide. Will he make it? Damn it, that was my lunch. At dawn the next day we reached the eastern boundary of the area I intended to survey. By then 48 hours had passed since the airborne sighting of the boat in distress. Assuming that such a craft, I could not call it a ship, would be blown about 4 knots by the wind, I calculated that it must be about 192 miles from the place of initial discovery. I was promised that aviation would take part in the search, but it didn't go any further than that, which, however, didn't surprise me. In such weather an airplane probably could not take off, and if it did, it would not have seen anything anyway. I began my search on a line 200 miles from the initial sighting of the watercraft. It was like looking for a needle in a giant haystack. The only hope was the fact that the wind direction had not changed in the last 2 days. On the second shoulder of the 30-mile zigzag that we were doing, at exactly 10 a.m. The observer shouted, "I see a submarine on the surface." At first glance, the message seemed credible, and I hastily pressed the alarm button so that the men could get to their battle stations in time. Through the binoculars, I could see the object quite clearly. It definitely had the outline of a German submarine, the long bow parallel to the surface of the water and the fighting deckhouse. But it was somehow too slack on the surface of the water, blindly obeying the slightest movement of the waves. No, it could have been anything but a German submarine. Suddenly I realized that it was the watercraft we were looking for. We approached it quickly, but it showed no signs of life. It was much smaller than we had expected. Later it turned out to be part of the deck cargo of a torpedoed American merchant ship, and at its aft end we could see the fighting deckhouse. The engine room must have been underneath. The entrance to it was blocked by a heavy hatch. Before sinking it with gunfire, we decided to knock on the door, firing a few warning shots. The hatch lifted up rather quickly, and an extremely surprised, sleepy face was revealed. I armed myself with a loudspeaker, apologized for disturbing the people's sleep, and asked what we could do to help them. It didn't take us long to hoist the surviving sailors aboard and sink the empty craft. After that, we set course for home. Each S-class destroyer returning from a combat cruise joined the new 21st Escort Group. We gained an unusual amount of respect for ourselves. Weren't we the fastest group in the Western Ocean? The other ships were commanded by senior lieutenants, career Royal Navy officers. They were assigned to these destroyers to learn ship handling skills, gain combat experience, and then move on to the new Hunt-class destroyers that were just starting to appear. We could go anywhere in close formation and perform maneuvers not available to other escort groups because of the large difference in speed and circulation radius of different types of ships. High-speed maneuvers are safe only when all ships have the same performance characteristics. When destroyers, corvettes, frigates and trawlers are gathered in one group, only the simplest maneuvers can be performed. As soon as the formation of the group was completed, we became escorts for fast convoys consisting of large troop transports that were bringing American soldiers from training bases in Iceland to England to prepare for D-Day. It was a very demanding job. The speed of the convoy was 15 knots, in other words. We had quite a sufficient margin of speed to give the ships a good defense in conditions where there was a high probability of attack on the ships by enemy submarines from an underwater position. An attack on a high-speed convoy of submarines from a surface position is unlikely. If a surfaced submarine approaches such a convoy from the front, it is certain to be detected by the radar of one of the escort ships. If it approaches from behind, due to its own low speed, it will quickly fall hopelessly behind the target and will never be able to reach a favorable position for an attack. To the senior escort officer, such convoys do not cause much trouble, and since I always had at least 4 destroyers to protect the 3 troop transports, sonar created a truly reliable screen. Compared to ocean convoys, which included 60 to 100 merchant ships, our small, compact, fast-moving unit in a constant zigzag kept even the most reckless German submarine commanders from futile attacks. We never once met the enemy. Of course, we were satisfied with this after all. Our job was to safely deliver ships to their destination, but nevertheless, we were all eager to record at least one enemy submarine on the account of the group. Very often discussing our business in port, we made plans on how to lure a German submarine into our nets. But we always had convoys with us, and the opportunity never presented itself. Finally, the chance came. We hoped to at least throw the bait if it will take a big fish. The group was to go to sea on Saturday to accompany the convoy to Iceland. But when the Shikari had been destroyer on duty the day before, we were rushed to Liverpool. It was to deliver a new German magnetic mine, discovered after the fall of Bizerte. It was being taken home in a frigate, and the wooden box in which it was packed was spoken of only in whispers and respectfully referred to as Package A. Unfortunately for us, the frigate with this precious cargo on board was in such a hurry to get home that the cars could not keep up the race, and it had great difficulty in reaching Londonderry. The Shikari was to take the package to Liverpool. A special lorry from London with a team of experienced bomb disposal men would be waiting for us there. We loaded the Devil's box and set a course for Liverpool. We were warned that it should be handled with all possible caution and not to shake it. Because there were no sappers in Bizerte, and those who prepared it for transportation, although they thought they had neutralized the mine, still could not vouch for it. We arrived in Liverpool on Saturday at 1 o'clock sharp and found that everyone had gone to lunch. By the time people returned, it was nearing evening and, as it turned out, no one knew anything about Package A. Nor were they willing to make inquiries, at least not until Monday. The whole mess had nothing to do with the Western Approach's fleet. Our shore services were not in the loop at all. That was the concern of the commander in Liverpool. And the Shikari had to get back to her duties as an escort ship as soon as possible. We ended up unloading the damned crate onto the quay ourselves, explaining to the crane operator who agreed to help that the crate contained the embalmed body of a beautiful Guerrier, the favourite concubine of a Tunisian bey. Eventually I managed to get through to the commander personally. "It's about Package A, sir." "I don't know anything about Package A. What's in it?" "A mine, sir. A new German magnetic mine. And no one knows how safe it is." "Where is it now?" There was real concern in his voice now. "On the dock at Gladstone Dock, sir." "Oh my God, I'll take care of it." He kept his promise. Not an hour later, a truckload of sappers pulled into the dock, but our convoy had already left, and the Shikari had to go alone to join the group in Iceland. All German submarines going from Germany to the North Atlantic, as well as all submarines returning to Germany for repairs, must pass between the Faroe Islands and Iceland. We were on our own for once, without a convoy, so we decided to throw a trap. In the old days, B-12 ships used to use barrels of fuel oil to deceive the enemy. The naval depot in Londonderry was happy to get rid of the surplus. All the groups hunted enemy submarines. Only we never got a chance to do it. So on our way north, we took the bait. On the second night, when we were in an area that the enemy submarines could not pass if they were on the route at all, we lowered a barrel with a fuse into the water, made sure that it stayed afloat, set it on fire, and let it drift. At the same time, we fired a few rockets to be spotted by those subs that might be over the horizon line. The deed was done. We only had to wait for the result. The contents of the barrel burned out. After making sure that the floating flare did not attract the attention of any German boats, we set a course for Iceland. But we did not foresee the actions of the coastal aviation. They spotted our fuel oil drum and reported it as a burning and sinking vessel. Only they gave coordinates 20 miles to the south. The Western Approach's fleet commander ordered us to look into it. We couldn't disobey the order. Finding nothing new, I had to send a message that read, "Regarding the report of the scout plane, nothing detected." I presume he saw a burning barrel of fuel oil, set on fire by me in position. On my return to Londonderry, I was summoned by the commander. I'll be honest, I was terrified. Admiral Max Horton had a reputation for being too tough. As I entered the office, I was met with a very unkind look. "What the devil did you decide to set fire to my ocean, Rainer?" "I wanted to catch a German submarine for you, sir." The Admiral chuckled, then stood up from his desk and invited me into the operations room. "Look, there is a vast minefield in this stretch of sea between the Faroe Islands and Iceland. The Germans call it the Rose Garden. All the mines are set deep. Coastal aviation forces the subs to stay underwater. We hoped they'd be blown up by the mines. They don't, or they do, but not often enough. I'm going to send your group to the Faroe Islands. When the weather forecasts are good, you'll go out to sea on patrol. If the weather is too bad, you'll stand by in Gulfjord on a 2-hour standby. If there is a report of a boat sighting, you will go to the point with the specified coordinates at full speed and sink the submarine. Coastal aviation damages the subs, but only a few are sunk. Captain Walker, acting on such a scheme, performs miracles. You can do the same. The Metropolitan Fleet Commander will throw in 3 destroyers to help you, and the 10th Escort Group will be relocated to Iceland. They will support you at the other end. All in all, you now have the same odds as Walker." "Not exactly, sir." "What do you mean?" "The weather, sir. It's terrible. Captain Walker operates in more favourable weather conditions in close cooperation with the Air Force. He finds his victims closer to the coast of France than I can get to the coast of Norway. Still, I'm extremely grateful for the chance, sir. Don't forget that I commanded the Northern Patrol Group and know all about the weather conditions in this area. I hope you'll do your best. And he left and headed for his office. You bet I will, sir. Already on the threshold I still stopped and added, I hope, sir, the 3 destroyers you spoke about will be selected with my seniority. Leave that question to me. A sneer flickered in the Admiral's eyes, I thought. You have another voyage to Iceland? Yes, sir. We delivered another convoy to Iceland and stood in Reykjavik, waiting for the transports to be relieved of their cargo of soldiers. There was always plenty of fish in the harbour. So many of the sailors took up fishing to provide fresh fried fish for dinner. Over lunch the officers discussed the theoretical issues of fishing, and our gunnery officer developed a whole theory, the gist of which was that the most expedient method of catching fish was to use an explosive charge placed in a basket of fish entrails, intended to serve as bait, and detonated from shore by remote control. In order not to spoil the enjoyment of the sailors sitting with fishing rods, the officers took a boat and moved away from the ship. The shell was stowed in a used paper basket and covered with fish innards. I insisted that the motorboat be located specifically on the Shikari because I wanted to be able to visit the other destroyers of the group in all weathers. When the motorboat was far enough away from the ship, we carefully lowered the basket into the water and were about to blow it up when someone, I think it was the doctor, noticed that the Shikari had raised the motorboat's flags we were being summoned. Cursing something unknown that was interfering with our fishing, we looked at the ship with all our eyes. We could see people bustling about on the upper deck. Then the signalman on the bridge began to semaphore. "Number 1, would you do me the favour to read what they want, while I blow up this basket of bones," I said, and immediately turned to the gunner. "What do you say I should do?" "Touch that battery contact." "Yes, sir." "Yes, sir." I did. Somewhere below there was a deafening explosion, and curious faces leaned over the side, trying to see the result in the water. At first nothing happened, but in a few seconds a rather large bubble of air flew out of the water, bringing back all the fish innards. Now 4 faces, wet and soiled with fish entrails, turned to the chief mate, who was still reading the signal transmitted from the destroyer. And only the doctor was trying to fish a single stunned small flounder out of the water, all we could deliver to the officers' fish feast. "So, Blackie," I asked, scrubbing myself with great difficulty, "what do they want?" "You've been promoted." "A 6-month promotion, sir." "Promoted? What did I get?" "Commander, I suppose, sir." "Nonsense. It just can't be. I'm only 35. Even if I were a commissioned officer in the Royal Navy, I'd have to serve another year or 2, and as for volunteer reserve officers, there are very few commanders, and I haven't heard of anyone dying lately. Besides, if it's a 6-month promotion, it can't be a temporary rank." The runabout motor was started, and we headed back to the ship. The crew had a good laugh as we boarded wet, dirty, and with only 1 small fish as a catch. But it all turned out to be true. The seniority problem for Operation Rose Garden was solved that way. About a month later, I was sitting on a carpet of soft heather in a small depression between 2 mountains in the Faroe Islands. Below I could see the mirrored surface of the fjord. It was about 6 miles long, and nowhere more than 3/4 of a mile wide throughout. The part facing south shone and shimmered with all shades of gold, reflecting the midday sun. The northern half had a bright, rich colour, like the cloudless blue sky above it. Nothing was heard, only a light breeze slightly disturbing the heather, which was quite unusual. More often than not the winds here were very strong. Periodically, wisps of clouds torn by the northeast wind appeared over the mountains on the other side of the fjord and drifted away across the clear sky, casting shapeless shadows on the calm mirror of the water. Far below stood my ships. The Shikari led the column. Behind him were 3 destroyers sent by the Metropolitan Fleet, Meteor, Oribe, and Opportunity, followed by the rest of the S-class destroyers Sardonyx, Saudadinx, Sabre, Saladin, and Scimitar. In all, 8 destroyers participated in Operation Rose Garden. Over 1,800 men. It was a serious team. But it was heavy on my heart. Operation Rose Garden had failed. and it was my duty to inform the Western Approach's fleet commander that there was no point in continuing it. Perhaps I had gone into the mountains precisely to find some solitude and to think about things in peace. It wasn't the enemy that defeated us. The worst enemy was the weather. But how can I tell the Admiral that my efforts have failed miserably? Before I took out of my pocket a pencil and a piece of paper, which I had thoughtfully brought with me to draft a letter, I smoked a pipe and thought deeply. The events of the last few weeks were passing before my mind's eye. Exactly 3 weeks ago we had arrived in Gulf Jord. 5 destroyers had entered the harbour to do some serious work. While still following the narrow entrance, we saw 3 destroyers already anchored. My petty officer signalman retrieved a small blue and white flag. This flag, or rather triangular flag, was not normally used by us in the Western Approach's fleet group. But it awakened nostalgic memories of pre-war preparations, when the sea seemed to be a continuous holiday and it was not prowled by wolf packs of German submarines. "What is it, signalman?" I asked. "A senior officer's pennant, sir." "You know we don't use it." "Navy destroyers don't know that, sir. Yesterday I found out we didn't have one, so I made one myself." "All right, yeoman, let it hang while we're here. I've been thinking. What the Navy destroyers don't know is that on the Western Approaches it's customary for ships to anchor independently of each other. It's not just because our anchorages are usually so congested that it's simply impossible to find a large enough free area for all the ships in a group to come together behind each other. The fact is that groups usually have ships of many different types and sizes with different anchors and anchor chains, so that anchoring in one place is often not only dangerous but impossible. In addition to this, there was a technical reason why ships did not anchor as a whole flotilla together. When the anchors begin to drop at the same time, the ships are usually still moving forward, and the chain can hit the not-so-sturdy dome that houses the ASDIC. Unlike frigates, corvettes and trawlers, on destroyers the ASDIC can be retracted inside the hull, which means there's no reason why we can't anchor together as a flotilla. Signalman, the group will deploy in a flotilla. Tell everyone and make sure they don't forget to raise the ASDIC domes. Better send the assistant bosun to get another signalman on the bridge. You'll need him." Soon brightly coloured flags fluttered on the knock rays on ours, an order, on others, a response. The signalmen were transmitting information about the Shikari's anchoring and speed, so that the ships following it would maintain their position. "We're approaching our chosen anchorage." "Okay, now slow down. We've slowed down so much that we're barely making waves. Stop cars." The calmness around us seemed even stranger. There was only the hum of the big fans blowing air into the boiler rooms, and the ear used to it could not hear it. Another signal. The pennants fell, and 5 anchors plunged simultaneously into the deep clear water. "Signalman, request the Meteor. How tall is their captain?" "About 6 feet, sir." "I'll have to take your quarters for a meeting. Mine is only 5 feet 9 inches high." "Gladly." That day proved to be the last time I ever experienced anything pleasant. The very next day came a report from the airplane about the detection of a German submarine. We immediately went to sea even before we received the corresponding order from the commander. On calm water under the cover of the shore, we moved at a speed of 25 knots. Following the Shikari was the Meteor in our opinion. It was just huge. After rounding the Cape, Shikari literally sank in the first wave that swept us in the open Atlantic. We had to reduce our speed immediately, having a legitimate fear that the Meteor might ram us, but it too went noticeably slower. As he rose on another wave, I could contemplate both his bridge and the plates of the keel plating. The 8 destroyers, which until a few minutes ago had been a compact, orderly unit, now found themselves scattered over a fairly wide area. The keel and side rocking, the ups and downs of the waves made it seem as if the ships were doing some strange, mad dance, while periodically showering themselves with fountains of water. When they fell between the waves, only the masts and sometimes the tops of chimneys were visible. Then an invisible force threw them on the crest of the wave, exposing the entire bow, as if the ship for a second was in a dry dock, and at the same time on the sides of the decks flowed turbulent streams of foaming water. The point where the submarine was sighted from the airplane was 100 miles away. We were supposed to get there in 5 hours after the first signal was received. It was heard that the airplane kept pointing us at the target. But the crossing took us 12 hours. I had already ordered the Navy destroyers to go forward, but it turned out that their capabilities in terms of speed in such weather is not superior to ours. After 6 hours the airplane had to leave. We spent 24 hours in a severe storm and fruitless search, after which we returned to Gulf Jord. The rest was the same, if not worse. On the first day at least the connection with the airplane was good. Afterwards even that was gone. For some reason unknown to me, radio communication is always bad in this part of the world. In the end I decided it was best to write a personal letter. Dear Admiral Hortoy, I have to inform you that due to inclement weather and poor communications I was not able to achieve success in Operation Rose Garden. All my accomplishments for the past 3 weeks are that 5 destroyers of the Western Approaches fleet have been reduced to an unseaworthy condition despite tireless care. A detailed report of the damage received due to the weather has been sent by me to Londonderry. I have considered transferring to one of the fleet destroyers, leaving Lieutenant Blackwood in command of the Shikari, but although the larger destroyers offer better conditions for men, they do not really possess any substantial advantage in speed over the S-class destroyers. In addition, I believe that our ships have a better chance of reaching the enemy. Navy destroyers can only drop 5 series of depth bombs, they don't have heavy charges for deep-sea subs, and they are not very controllable in bad weather at high speeds. Fleet officers gave me full support and showed themselves with the best side, and the actions of our people in general above all praise. Whenever we went to sea, the accommodation decks of our ships were splashed with water at least a foot deep, but I never heard a complaint. It could have been tolerated if only the radio communication had been a little better. I think there is something peculiar about the atmosphere here that prevents communication. Not infrequently we have been unable to establish direct communication with an airplane describing circles over our heads, and have had to relay messages to it via Iceland. 2 days ago we had to request Quebec to transmit a message to an airplane 6 miles away, and my last information to you, sir, went through New York because we could not reach any of the stations in Great Britain. It is my profound conviction that with the forces available there is no point in continuing Operation Rose Garden under existing conditions. This report is written by me with a sense of deep disappointment, but I have felt it my duty to do so. I set my pencil aside and looked down again. The Shikari, caught by a gust of wind, had turned slightly and swung sideways as far as the length of the anchor chain would allow. It was now slightly away from the other ships. The local soldiers had appealed to us for help, so we sent some men ashore from each ship this morning. The boats had just returned and were still bobbing in the water off the side of the ships. On the Oribe we decided to take advantage of the lull to paint the topside. There were cradles hanging and men scrambling about. Suddenly the roar of powerful engines made me look up. Beha Heinkel was flying directly over my head. It was travelling so low between the hills that I could have shot it down if I had the proper weapon at hand. I could clearly see its nose tilted forward. The airplane was following the terrain. A moment later it was below me. It was flying down towards the water towards my ships. I could tell exactly at what moment he would launch his attack. His wing came down as he went into a turn, coming in for a bombing run. Now the other wing came down, he turned again, and was now coming straight for the ships below. He would bomb the Shikari and fire on the others. I was praying and cursing desperately, and I think I was doing it at the same time. The decks were full of people. Our ship's radars were useless under the cover of the high shore, so we relied on shore stations for air raid warnings. The airplane was flying very fast. God. Shikari. Do something, they're acting. Thank you, Lord, they're acting. I saw a trail of tracer bullets from the left side's Alicon, then an explosion. And then the starboard eagle gun on the Shikari started talking. Well done, boys. How unbearably slow the little red dots are rising toward the huge black airplane. I clearly saw how the German twitched the way a frightened pheasant behaves when a bullet flies over his head. The bombing run was ruined. The German went sharply upward, how black his wings seemed against the golden blue water. A cloud of white smoke appeared above the stern tube of the Shikari. Excellent. They remembered the anti-aircraft gun. The airplane was gaining altitude rapidly. Only now did I hear the sound of the first shots. The Navy destroyers were in action, anti-aircraft guns rumbled. Now following the distant Heinkel from all the ships carried points of tracer bullets. I will never forget the feeling that seized me at the sight of the ominous iron bird, hidden behind the mountain on the other side of the fjord. The firing stopped. There was peace and quiet in the anchorage again. But if the guys on the Shikari hadn't gotten there in time, the picture would have been very different. Fire, chaos, death everywhere. I knelt on the soft heather and offered a prayer of thanks to God and the men who had not failed. And how could I not think of the sailors who died in Norway, so that we gained invaluable experience? So, we were discovered. The German must have managed to photograph the anchorage. Even if it means nothing to the pilot, the officers of the headquarters cannot fail to realize from our white and green camouflage that here is an escort group waiting for submarines. Only groups of ships of the Western Approaches fleet carried such camouflage, and it was as obvious a sign as if the blue pad had been labelled in white letters, "Beware now all boats would pass the Rose Garden underwater." They will be detected much less frequently, and fall is just around the corner. In June, Captain Walker in the area of Brest sent to the bottom 3 German submarines, in July 2 more. In the Rose Garden account was never opened. I folded the letter neatly, slipped it into my pocket, and went below, where a boat was waiting for me at the water's edge. The gun crew, spontaneously formed on the Shikari to repel a deadly attack, was very peculiar: a cook, a barman, a sick helmsman, and a boiler machinist. The boiler machinist was the gunner of the first Oerlikon to open fire. The cook jumped out of the galley and opened fire from a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. The staff gunner who arrived was quite annoyed to find his gun smeared in some sweet cream. I sent Max Horton my letter. A week later we were recalled. The Navy destroyers were ordered to proceed to Scapa. 4 S-class destroyers went to Londonderry for repairs, and I was ordered also to go on the Shikari to Scapa, where a plane would be waiting at Gadsden to take me to a meeting at Rosyth. It was August 1943. In the 3 years during which I had not been in Scapa, fantastic changes had taken place here. Where once there had been endless marshy fields and eroded dirt roads, there were now good-sized houses and a network of paved roads. Comfortable mess halls were built for sailors and officers. In short, the place of the salty wilderness was now a businesslike and very busy town, and there were even women's auxiliary policemen on the roads, nothing like it had ever been here before. We docked at the side of the mother ship, and I received an invitation from Admiral Fraser, the commander of the Metropolitan Fleet, to dine on his flagship, the King George V. I must confess that I was delighted. I must confess that I was quite out of sorts and extremely depressed about the failure of Operation Rose Garden, and thought that everyone was already talking about it. Admiral Fraser showed so much tact and understanding, and was so friendly, that his kindness brought me back to life a little. He was well aware of the difficulties we had encountered, and after talking to him I began to hope that our own Admiral, though disappointed, would doubtless realize that my fault was not here. The next day I went to Gadsden, where an airplane was to be waiting for me. The weather was atrocious, visibility not exceeding 200 yards, it was raining, and when it stopped briefly, a thick, heavy fog enveloped everything. Under these conditions, the tiny airplane I finally found did not seem a reliable means of transportation. I found the pilot in the dining room, and the first thing he did was to inform me that he had no desire to fly. I could not but agree with him. We ate together, but during the meal he was called to the telephone. When he came back, he said that we would have to fly because some very important people from the Admiralty were coming to meet us. With obvious reluctance, we climbed into the airplane. The visibility was about halfway down the runway. Turning to me, the pilot grumbled that these important people would have to attend our funeral to make the event look representative. Then he engaged the clutch or whatever they do to airplanes, and we hurtled into the fog. After a minute of nothingness, I wondered, "When are we going to take off?" "We're already in the air." "Are we?" That seemed unlikely to me. I continued to see nothing, Following this, in fairly quick succession, we almost hit a lighthouse, a ship entering the Pentland Firth, and the top of a cliff near Duncansby Head. The latter seemed to me a distinct overkill. I wished I knew why we should not climb to a safe altitude and use the navigational instruments rather than trying to steer the plane by landmarks on the ground. It turned out that this airplane had no more accurate navigational instruments than the human eye. Only now I understood why pilots of small airplanes are always very inaccurate in determining their location and do not try to learn at all. First we flew along the crest of the ridge, then at Nairn we turned to Peterhead. Peterhead gave us a real headache. The fact was that the local detachment of barrage balloons, which had been neglected to warn us of our daring flight, had all their balloons on alert, so that we nearly stayed there forever. After Aberdeen, however, normal clear weather set in, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon we landed at Donnybristle. Here, as there was no flying, a trench was dug across the landing strip, which we had to jump over. After such exciting adventures, the meeting was seen as an opportunity to take a break. A variety of high-ranking officers were present, and I found myself the only representative of the Metropolitan Fleet Commander and the Western Approaches Fleet Commander. I was too tired to be polite and choose my words carefully, so I spoke my mind. No one seemed surprised, no one argued. That was the end of Operation Rose Garden. I never heard anyone bring it up again. It is curious how a theoretically flawless plan failed in practice, and even more so in waters that were always vital to the defence of the islands. If war came to Britain, it seemed obvious that another attempt would be made to use submarines to cut our trade routes. Most of these submarines, if not all, would have to pass through the Rose Garden. In only 2 cases is the probability of encountering German submarines maximised when the wolves are nibbling game, in other words, attacking the convoy and when they are forced to take certain routes to their bases. The task of sinking them in these areas we in that war never solved. After the meeting I was offered the use of the same vehicle in which I arrived here to return. I flatly refused and used the train and ferry. What can you do? I have no particular inclination to fly. At Londonderry we joined the group. With the most serious damage repaired, we set course for Rothesay, which is located at the entrance to Kyles of Bute, which is the first left turn after passing Cumbrae Lighthouse on the way up the Clyde. The British submarine fleet had an excellent record in the Mediterranean, particularly in attacking fast ships off the Italian coast. The Italians had a number of small fast destroyers, and to protect themselves from our submarines, they began to create barriers around their small convoys. A torpedo is similar to a shell in only one respect: both are fired from a tube. That's where the similarity ends. A shell travels at several hundred miles per hour, and its journey takes seconds. The speed of a torpedo is slightly less than twice the speed of a fast merchant ship, and it is on the road for several minutes. In order for a submarine to attack successfully, it must assume a strictly defined position, which is about a mile from the target at a 45-degree angle to its course. If the fast destroyers are zigzagging on either side of the convoy, the submarine captain finds it very difficult to bring the submarine into a convenient position for attack, for he must constantly raise his periscope, first, to see the target, and second, to prevent close contact with the enemy destroyer. The more often he raises the periscope, the more likely the boat is to be detected. At Rothesay we were tasked with portraying Italian destroyers escorting merchant ships, and our young submarine captains had to learn the basics of their profession. It was a wonderful period, at least from a ship handling point of view. We sailed back and forth on Loch Long at 30 knots, not only during the day but also at night. We perfected all our usual manoeuvres and even learned a number of new ones, as it was known that they were often used by the Italians. We achieved a truly superior level of ship navigation, rare even in peacetime, when movement at high speed is not often practiced for reasons of economy. We learned to execute the most complicated zigzags by following together in close formation. It was jewellery work and could not fail to please the eye after all. There were no more beautiful ships in the world than mine. The designs for the Hood, the Hawkins and Frobisher heavy cruisers, and the S-class destroyers were created at about the same time. It was a period when beauty, elegance of lines were successfully combined with the demands of efficiency. In my opinion, none of the modern ships, perhaps with the exception of some destroyers built just before the war, were as beautiful. Ships built later no longer had the smooth contours of their predecessors, and were therefore not as graceful. The most impressive sight was a group of S-class destroyers travelling at high speed. From under the high, sturdy forepegs to the side scattered waves, as if birds spread their wings. Turning the rudder and the ships synchronously turn, the stern of each describes a wide arc, as if smoothing the rippling sea. The narrow hulls slowly level out the ship is set on a new course, and the group follows in the same flawless order. I still don't know how we managed to avoid accidents with our submarines, but there were many moments when it seemed that disaster could not be avoided. The element of danger was always present, and this could not but worry the officers. After all, at any moment, even without performing any complex maneuvers, you could ram your own submarine, whose captain for a second confused. The constant tension was affecting many of us. People felt overworked. Personally, I also longed to be somewhere else anywhere. It was impossible to get rid of tension anywhere here. It hung in the air. The naval base, at which we moored when we were in the harbour, was a school for submariners. Meeting with its students, we could not help but pay attention to the enormous training loads these guys endured. And they coped, some better, others a little worse, but they all coped. Personally, it seems to me that representatives of each of the numerous services and branches of the army believed that they bore all the burdens of war on their shoulders, and put this idea into the heads of young officers. Although the truth was that a certain share of these burdens fell on the share of each. Today one, tomorrow another. Today in the battle involved pilots, tomorrow sailors, the day after tomorrow's success achieved submariners. And in the end everyone is saved by an inconspicuous labouring infantryman who walks on his own 2 feet through the enemy territory and says to the others, "All right, guys, you can go home. We've won." We went into Londonderry to clean the boilers, and I took the opportunity to pay another visit to Admiral Horton. It was the first time we had met since Operation Rose Garden, and he promised me something. He said, "We're going to have some big changes coming soon. The Americans are finishing building new Captain-class frigates, and new River-class frigates will start coming out of our shipyards in the near future." He concluded by saying, "Be that as it may, Rayner, I am counting on you as a promising senior officer. Wherever I send you temporarily, you can rest assured that sooner or later you will have a new group." Before leaving the group, I had the pleasure of welcoming another officer from the KVDR, LT, CMDR, TMDR, plane assigned to the Sardonyx. In addition, I have heard that LT, CMDR, Norman Wood, like myself, from Mersey Division, has been assigned a Hate-class destroyer. On the whole, I believe the volunteer Navy justified the confidence of the career officers who supported us. There were never many of us, because there was always someone convinced that those who came out of the QVDR could only serve as junior officers, and nothing more. Fortunately, we were supported by some fairly serious people. Back on the Shikari, I was ordered to Grangemouth to dry dock, and there I was waiting to be assigned to His Majesty's ship Warwick in place of Commander Macleaves. In October 1943, I left for Liverpool for the Warwick. In mid-September 1943, the submarine war in the Atlantic passed its decisive stage. Grand Admiral Dinitz changed the tactics he had previously adhered to and ordered that escort ships be considered as important targets as merchant ships. I do not mean to say at all that the German submariners, in an attempt to prevent an attack that would have fatal consequences for them, had never before fired torpedoes at our escort ships. I just mean that in the matter of target selection the Germans have changed priorities. And here in one convoy 4 escort ships were torpedoed. When I learned of the loss of our ships, I was reminded of Commander Howard Johnston's remark at one of the meetings. When asked to what extent a captain could jeopardize his own ship by attacking a German submarine, he replied, "And there is no risk. German submarines go to sea to sink merchant ships. For their commanders you are not a target at all, but only an unfortunate misunderstanding that preventing to get to this target. When the first escort ship will be sunk intentionally, it will be safe to say that the Germans are defeated and the war is won. All other operations will already be the final destruction of the enemy." It is now evident that Howard Johnston's assessment was quite correct. It is probably worth mentioning briefly what has changed since those days when we were staring defeat in the face, which seemed inevitable. I suppose the change can be most fully defined by the word coordination. It was through coordination that the escort groups became strong teams in which everyone knew what they had to do and how their neighbour would behave. In addition, we were now assisted by ground-based aviation in all the space to which such aircraft could reach, and in the area beyond the range of coastal aviation, we soon began to use Swordfish based on light escort aircraft carriers. The latter were mostly converted ships, and thanks to the great courage and dedication of young pilots who took to the air on the Swordfish, proved to be unusually effective. Max Horton's restless nature helped bring about these major reforms. The word coordination is, of course, the answer to our question, but it is not complete. Everything else is much more complex. To make sense of what happened, we need to look at the entire strategy of the anti-submarine campaign. In what I have written so far, I have deliberately not put the reader in the position of a German submarine captain about to attack a convoy. So for now, therefore, my reader is likely to be in some perplexity, as indeed we were until the tactical school of Western approaches dispelled the fog in our minds. The war with German submarines was fought almost spontaneously, for no one had prepared us for such a turn of events before the war. We were taught to detect and pursue the enemy in an underwater position with the help of an ASDIC, and we vastly overestimated the killing power of the available depth bombs against the welded solid hull. For various reasons, our designers were very unfavourable to welded construction. Our own pre-war submarines had a solid hull in which the plates were riveted together. Welded seams were thought to be less reliable. In practice, it turned out that welding was much harder to destroy than our designs. It was claimed in training that fatal damage to a boat could be done at a distance of 60 feet, but we found that a depth bomb had to explode much closer, and even then the effect was not guaranteed. Depth bombs always had to be aimed in 2 dimensions horizontally and in depth. ASDIC gave us a good chance to correctly target the depth bomb in horizontal projection, but setting the depth bomb to the correct depth of detonation was much more difficult. In the shallow waters of the North Sea and in our coastal waters, the task was relatively easy, because the enemy had little room to maneuver inland. But in the deep waters of the Atlantic, enemy boat could easily and quickly descend to 600 feet, and this is still a rather impressive value, 5 times the height of Nelson's column in Trafalgar Square. And naturally, depth bombs needed time to sink to that depth, and in 2 minutes at 4 knots a submarine can travel 600 feet. If you ask the unsophisticated layman how a submarine attacks, he will probably say that it strikes from beneath the surface of the water. But the German submarines we fought against, especially in the early years of the war, usually operated on the surface of the water, using their diesel engines. The latter gave them the ability to travel much faster than a corvette, and even 2 knots faster than a trawler. A submarine is kept on the water by the air in its tanks, which supports it like a diving bell. To dive, all you have to do is open the air valves on these tanks and the boat goes underwater. In fact, the Germans used their submarines as torpedo carriers, and more rapidly than our escort ships. Having fired torpedoes, the boat could go deep or stay on the surface, depending on the situation. In the underwater position of the submarine was almost blind at night. Periscope is useless, and during the day its field of visibility is very limited. Therefore, in the first stages, all our efforts were reduced to making the German submarines submerge. This was done not only because underwater the enemy is less dangerous. Just then the submarine was in a position in which we were taught to destroy it. As soon as the attack began, we did our best to turn night into day by firing flares and rockets, thus endeavouring to force the German submarine to go underwater. The advent of radar gave us another eye, so to speak. We could now observe the enemy on the surface as well. Of course, I am narrating only in the most general terms. The target detected by radar might well have been a submarine. In the first terrible years of the war, the seas were covered with wreckage, and a submarine found by radar could turn out to be, for example, a lifeboat with or without people, part of a sunken ship, or something else. But either way, it was radar that was the beginning of the end of the German submarine campaign. I had taken a month's course in anti-submarine training before the war, but the escort work we were trained for was only to guard small organised groups of ships going together on the same zigzag. We judged the position of escort ships from publications in naval publications, which gave pictures of neat little convoys protected by as many escort ships as there were ships in the convoy. Our work in the Western Ocean in no way resembled the diagrams in the manuals. 2 destroyers and 4 corvettes were the entire escort for 80 merchant ships, spread over 40 square miles of sea space. After 2 weeks of Atlantic storms, one could only wonder if all the ships in the escort still had sophisticated electrical devices working much more often they stopped working altogether. The charming pictures in the pre-war books were beginning to look like nonsense, and the senior officers of the escort were struggling to make any use of the forces at their disposal. Besides, it is very difficult for a senior escort officer to keep track of what is going on, and there are both psychological and practical reasons for that. Allow me to invite you, dear reader, briefly to the bridge of the corvette escorting the convoy. Let us call it Pensy and put it in the starboard quarter, where it will be 5 or 6 miles from the senior officer's ship. At night, radio silence is broken only in emergencies. The ASDIC operator reports to the watch officer that he has an echo on the screen at 1,000 yards on the starboard traverse of the corvette. The watch officer calls the captain, who gives the command to reduce speed to investigate the contact. At the same time, the radar operator reports a faint echo from the stern of the convoy and adds that it sounds like a submarine. Trouble never comes alone. The captain decides to launch a surprise attack on the object detected by the sonar, then turn the ship around and illuminate the radar contact with flares. He leads the ship into the attack and commands fire, but immediately he hears whistling sounds coming from the ASDIC. They mean that the contact is nothing but a school of fish. He gives the signal to cease fire, but it's too late. The depth bombs have already rolled down the stern rails. The captain turns the ship around, gives the helmsman the distance and bearing and orders the flares to be fired. Depth bombs explode astern. A flare shell flashes right on the course and highlights the lifeboat rocking on the waves. It all turned out to be a false alarm, or to be more precise, 2 false alarms. However, with 20 merchant ships left unguarded in his quarter, the captain is obliged to act first and ask questions later. So he takes his place back in the marching order and, not wanting to be known as an alarmist, says nothing to anyone. He probably hopes that in the bad weather no one has heard anything, or if they have not realized what the matter is. However, the explosion of the depth bombs was noted on the senior officer's ASDIC, although their bearing was not established, and the flare shell the senior officer saw for himself, though not very clearly. They could have been fired either by one of the corvettes coming on either side of the convoy or by the trailing destroyer. 10 minutes later, a ship in the center of the convoy was torpedoed, followed by a second one. How many submarines are there? And where should the senior officer position the escort ships to intercept the enemy? And how can he prevent other submarines from approaching? Was the alarm he had observed really a false alarm? All these questions had to be answered, and the sooner the better. In the early years of the war, the senior officer had to find the solution to these questions himself. In his mind, using only his own knowledge, there were no instruments or training aids to help him. The fact that he was able to do this and did it his unconditional merit. It is impossible not to pay tribute to the knowledge and courage of the 1st Escort Group commanders. When the tactical school began in November 1942, Captain Roberts used models to illustrate selected tactics employed at different times by different group commanders. Very soon he was able to generalize them and develop a series of universal commands and maneuvers common to the ships of the Western Approaches fleet. The need for something more extensive and impartial than the brains of a single senior officer was immediately apparent, to provide a broad view of what was going on. In other words, the situation had to be seen as clearly as on the floor of a tactical classroom. To map by hand the positions of all escort ships, convoy ships and German submarines was an extremely laborious process, and it was still impossible to achieve a reliable picture in this way. Therefore, it was decided to equip first the ships of the senior officers, and later all the other ships of the escort with an excellent plotting device known as trace. It was connected with the ship's hydrocompass and electric lag, and produced a spot of light moving across the paper in exactly the same way as a ship moves across the surface of the sea. By plotting bearing and distance from this spot of light, the position of any object marked by radar or ASDIC could be plotted on a map. This was very helpful in target identification and classification. For example, if the Pensy had been able to make a radar contact in this way on the stern side of the convoy, it would very soon have become obvious that the object was stationary and slowly but surely falling behind the convoy. Consequently, it could hardly be a German submarine, and there was no point in wasting an illuminating shell. The same was true of the object detected by the ASDIC. A dense school of fish, which can give an echo marked by an ASDIC, moves very slowly. It is not at all difficult to determine this from the map. The captain would surely have realized that the enemy submarine is likely to move faster. We will now assume that the captain of the Pensy has already made his case, and we will go with the senior escort officer to the chart being plotted to find the answers to the questions listed. On the map, we will see a large blue arrow indicating the wind direction. It is pointing toward the left traverse of the convoy. It will be immediately clear that the fireworks arranged by the Pensy cannot pay much attention, because no man, in any case, no German submarine commander, looking for black silhouettes of ships in the dark night, will not want to approach the convoy from the leeward side, because on the bridge he will be pelted with icy spray. The senior officer's radar already shows that 2 vessels are out of marching order. They are torpedoed merchant ships. He takes the meter and easily determines that they are about 3 miles apart. So it is most likely, then, that 2 German submarines have slipped through the protective screen and are now probably already sheltered in deep water. But before he can begin his search, he must prevent the approach of other enemy submarines. He therefore gives orders to the 2 escort ships on the left side of the convoy to begin Operation Buttercup and points the arc of the compass. They will illuminate the desired sector with flares. Even though one of the escort ships does not belong to his group, the senior officer can rely on him. The order will be obeyed. It's been verified. Now must deal with the 2 German submarines, causing damage to the convoy. The destroyer closes the marching order. Here the senior officer instructs the destroyer together with the enthusiastic little Pensy to organize a search in the downwind direction from one ship in distress, and the corvette on the starboard traverse downwind from the other. The senior officer would have preferred to send another escort ship to help the ship forced to act alone, but he had no one else left, just himself. Until he could clear the situation, he would have to stay where he was in the vanguard of the convoy. He sent the escort ships to search upwind of the torpedoed ships for 2 reasons. First, a submarine would go deeper faster if it moved seaward. Once in the center of the convoy, its captain would want to be safe as soon as possible. And secondly, surface vessels traveling slowly are usually a little to windward, and a submarine traveling in the opposite direction will more quickly increase the distance between itself and the convoy. 2 corvettes performing Operation Buttercup suddenly break radio silence. 2 German submarines 5 miles off the left traverse of the convoy. A few minutes later, the following message is received: German submarines have submerged. The Admiralty may have notified the senior officer that day of the presence of 4 enemy submarines in the immediate vicinity of the convoy. Their position has now been charted, and they are all underwater. The initiative goes to Commander Blank. Within an hour, he can hunt for submarines. After that time, he will have to return to the convoy. But even if it is not possible to attack the enemy, he is likely to remain in an underwater position and will not surface until dawn. The advent of radar, the work of the tactical school, the installation of laybys on ships, and the standardization of basic orders in the conduct of Atlantic convoys were all nails hammered into the coffin lid of German submarines attacking a convoy. To attack the wolf pack in an organized manner, the Germans must detect the convoy during the day and pursue it, staying behind the horizon line, while regrouping in such a way that by night to be on the windward side of the convoy. Once air cover was secured, the game became too difficult for them to continue. In 1943, the Germans could at any moment detect overhead an airplane pointing at the game support group. By going on the offensive, Admiral Max Horton was no longer giving the enemy a breath. After the resounding success in March 1943, from the beginning of the summer, Dinitz began to suffer serious losses. Even in the area in the center of the Atlantic, previously lacking air cover, the U-boats could now be detected and attacked from the air. Long-range land-based aircraft had already appeared, and many escort groups included small aircraft carriers carrying air cover. Air-sea weapons were being finalized. and Dienitz was finally defeated. He withdrew all his subs from the Atlantic, waiting for the new weapon to be ready. It was an acoustic torpedo. When an escort ship, following radar readings, attacked a submarine out of the darkness, all she had to do was fire one of these new toys and wait for the explosion. The new torpedoes were equipped with acoustic devices that found their way to the noise of the attacking ship's propellers. We lost 4 escort ships before we figured out what we were dealing with. The acoustic torpedo was not a decisive weapon that could change the course of the war campaign, but it did have some effect in temporarily reducing the effectiveness of the sea hunters, who for safety reasons could not move at full speed. Reducing speed meant reducing our combat effectiveness. But fortunately, by that time we already had the opportunity to quickly increase the number of escort ships. That was the situation in the fall of 1943. Gone were the days when German submarines could safely gather in large groups in the center of the Atlantic. Now they had to work hard to find a target. The German Admiralty made attempts to anticipate the routes of our convoys, using for this purpose information obtained from reconnaissance aircraft and specially sent to sea for reconnaissance submarines. Having some, often sketchy information, the Germans sent their submarines to different sea areas, hoping at least somewhere to intercept the convoy. For the Germans, it was far from the best period. The effectiveness of the submarine fleet sharply decreased, and losses increased. The scales were slowly but surely tipping in our direction, just as they had 2 years before.